The Old West was a time of great change, and no period of American history has been romanticized like the Old West. So many monstrously significant events took place during this short period of history. Today we will talk about the great mysteries in the Old West, from lost gold mines to monsters of Native American folklore. Here are 10 great Old West legends. You ever heard of Doc Noss? This is one wild story from the Old West that not many people know about. He was a self-taught foot doctor who loved hunting for gold. One day him and his wife were poking around Victoria Peak out in New Mexico when they found this cave. They went deep inside, through these long tunnels, and what they found was absolutely insane. Colonial artifacts, old documents, and 16,000 gold bars. But Doc wasn't exactly the sharpest tool in the shed. When they came back to get the treasure, he had this brilliant idea to use dynamite to make the tunnel bigger. You can guess what happened. The whole thing collapsed. But Doc wasn't about to give up. He spent the rest of his life sweet-talking investors into funding new digs. But here's where it gets dark. One of those investors ended up killing him. Since then, treasure hunters have been all over that mountain, searching for Doc's gold. Nobody's found a single bar, but people still swear it's out there somewhere. There was once an Italian guy, Gian Baptist, moved to town and got himself a job as the local gravedigger. Seemed like a normal enough guy at first, but then people found out what he was really up to, digging up bodies after the funerals. The locals were furious. Angry mobs ready to lynch him in the street. The police had to think fast to keep him alive before his trial. So they came up with the idea. They shipped him off to this tiny island in the Great Salt Lake. The plan was to keep him there for several weeks alone. But when they came back 3 weeks later, he was nowhere to be found. Everyone figured he must have escaped somehow, maybe built a boat or tried swimming to shore. But nobody ever saw him again. To this day, nobody knows what happened to old Gian Baptist. 1800s Texas was an especially violent place. The whole place was wild. Outlaws, Mexican bandits, Comanche raiders, you name it. There was this one group of Mexican bandits who had this thing for stealing horses during sandstorms. One day they messed up and left a trail. Some Texas Rangers tracked them down and caught up with them near the Nueces, just south of where Uvalde is now. They killed the bandits, but here's where it gets wild. They cut off the leader's head, tied his headless body to a horse, and just let it ride off into the desert. But that's not even the crazy part. Soon after, people started telling these stories about a headless rider showing up all over Texas. They said he'd be holding his own head with these glowing eyes, chasing down anyone who couldn't outrun his horse. Bullets didn't do a thing to him, just passed right through. People are still telling stories about this Headless Horseman today. Bill Longley, they called him the man who was hanged 3 times. This guy was one of the deadliest gunslingers in the Old West, just wandering around Texas after the Civil War, shooting pretty much anyone who looked at him wrong. Said he killed 32 people. First time, a lynch mob caught him and strung him up. They rode off celebrating, shooting their guns in the air, and one of those stray bullets actually cut the rope. Years later, they finally caught up with him again in Louisiana and sentenced him to death. Second time around, the hangman messed up and used the wrong rope length, but they weren't about to let him go. They just hung him again. And that was supposed to be it for Bill Longley. Except his dad shows up one day saying it was all fake, claims Bill broke out of jail just before the hanging, and they killed some other poor soul instead. Now, Bill was known for breaking out of jail. Nobody knows for sure what really happened to him. It remains one more mystery from the Wild West. Here's a strange one about Poncho Villa, a famous Mexican revolutionary guy who was known for being super brave and charismatic. He had enemies on both sides of the border, and in 1923, they finally got to him. But that's not even the weird part. 3 years after they buried him, someone had dug up Villa's grave, cut off his head, and took it. Lots of people hated Villa, but who would do something like this? The trail went cold fast, and to this day, nobody knows where his head ended up. Now, some folks say it was stolen by some shady art dealer who sold it to some private collector in France. But here's the most interesting theory. It might have been some American college kids. There's this super secret society at Yale called Skull and Bones, also known as the Brotherhood of Death. These guys supposedly collect stolen skulls, including the skull of Geronimo. Word is, they paid 25 grand to have Villa's skull stolen. Maybe they've still got it sitting in their clubhouse right now. Back when the Spanish first came to the New World, there were these wild stories going around about 7 lost cities made of gold. Everyone in Europe was going crazy over it, sending expedition after expedition to find them. But they searched all over South and Central America and came up empty-handed. Fast forward to the Old West Gold Rush, and suddenly these stories pop up again. But now people were saying these cities were in California, or Colorado, or Arizona. And man, did that get people excited. Everyone and their brother was out there looking for them. The story went that these cities were surrounded by nothing but desert for miles. And if you were heading the right way, you'd start seeing the bodies of all the explorers who didn't make it. The idea was, if you could make it past all those bodies and keep going, you'd find more gold than you could ever spend. We still don't know if there's any truth to it. In remote Nevada stands El Dorado Canyon, a gold and silver mining hotspot for over 100 years. But with all that money came trouble, murders, shootouts, the whole 9 yards. So people kept these big dogs around the camps for protection. But here's the messed up part. When the mines dried up and people left, they did something awful. They just tied up their dogs and left them there to die. Real cold-hearted stuff. These days El Dorado Canyon's a ghost town. But people say if you go there late at night, you can still hear those dogs howling, and it gets creepier. They say you'll hear chains dragging on the ground, getting closer and closer. The story goes, if you don't run when you hear those chains, well, let's just say those ghost dogs aren't too friendly, and I don't blame them one bit. Henry Plummer was a legendary lawman of the Wild West. This guy was living a double life. He wore the badge, but he was also running a gang of outlaws on the side. Actually, he'd use his position as sheriff to figure out which stagecoaches were carrying gold from the local mines, then rob them blind. This went on for years. Everyone kind of knew what was going on. Eventually, some locals got fed up and formed this vigilante group. They caught Plummer and executed him. But after his death, none of the gold he had stolen was recovered. No matter how hard they tried, no one could find it. It's about 200 grand worth, and that's in Old West money. People say he buried it somewhere near the town of Bannock. Treasure hunters have been looking for it ever since, but nobody's found a thing. Maybe it's still out there, or maybe it's just another one of those tall tales. We'll probably never know for sure. Every culture's got its myths about crazy creatures. Native Americans had stories about these massive birds called Thunderbirds. Most settlers just laughed it off as folklore until 1890. That's when this newspaper in Tombstone, Arizona, published this wild story. According to them, some locals actually shot down one of these Thunderbirds. They said it was bigger than any bird anyone had ever seen before. At first, there weren't any pictures, just the story. But then all these photos started showing up, supposedly showing this giant dead bird. It wasn't just a one-time thing. After that, all these other towns across the Old West started reporting their own Thunderbird sightings. Makes you wonder what those folks were really seeing up there. Many unsolved Old West mysteries tell of strange hidden mines. In this one, 2 guys crossing the Sierra Nevada mountains back in 1857. Story goes they were with a bigger group, but somehow got separated. That's when they stumbled onto something crazy. This huge deposit of weird-looking rock turns out to be gold. But here's where it gets dark. By the time they back home, one guy was dead and the other was barely hanging on. Right before he died, he told his doctor about the mine and roughly where to find it, and then died. The doctor was so excited he immediately went looking for that mine but never found it. Word got out and soon people searching all over those mountains. That was more than 150 years ago, and you know what? People are still looking for that mine today.